This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. This week, we continue our conversation about Edwidge Danticat's The Art of Death, picking up where we left off. So if you haven't heard last week's episode, go back and check that out. This week's episode is sponsored by the Writer's Craft Super Stack, a hand-curated digital collection of over 40 premium tools and resources valued at over $3,000 that will help you master the craft of writing. This digital collection will help you turn your premise into a fleshed-out outline in minutes. Discover the 4 foundational story elements to unforgettable characters, compelling dialogue, page-turning scenes, and fantastic worlds that come to life before your eyes. You will master genre-specific writing techniques in everything from romance to children's books to memoirs and film. Get instant access to 7 premium software tools that will help you to plan, organize, and write your book with ease. Save tons on world-class editing, design, and formatting to get your book publish-ready before the year is up. But the Writer's Craft Super Stack special offer is expiring soon, so don't wait. Go to the show notes at storyworkspodcast.com to get the link to the Writer's Craft Super Stack today.
Definitely, and again, I think that's where personal experience, a life experience, can really make a big difference there too, because we can imagine how we felt when we were told news, or when we first person witnessed, or when I can remember the very first time that I saw as a young child an aftermath of a bicycle and a truck accident where the cyclist was killed. Wow. And it's still there in my in my head. You just, because we were walking back from the shops, the whole family, so myself, my younger sister. I would have been, I don't know, maybe 7 or something like that, perhaps, and to see a giant semi-trailer sort of parked in the middle of a traffic light, stoplight sort of crossroads, and then the body wasn't even covered. It was just a man lying on the ground with this sort of, and it was raining, so there's all this pink sort of, washing away down the road, and the shock is still with me. Yeah, more than half a century later, and so I think being able to pull in that from a first-person experience when you're writing about death, and the shock can send you into a suspension of time.
Right.
And that gives you, I think, some narrative space in first person to go to the first person narrator as opposed to the first person character, and use that moment in time to then let the reader have the experience of things sinking in as the shock occurs, if you like. So I think there are definitely techniques in there. Yeah, there are.
I mean, suspending or freezing time is a major one, and you described it perfectly, Robert, about how you can sort of take that character's, that now moment, and, freeze it and expand it and kind of step into that space where the shock lies, or where, whatever, and then pull back into the narrative. And it's like the first thing Kathryn said about using time and imagery. So you take that element of pulling back and expanding the narrative. There's the timepiece, and then the pink washing down the road. There's that image, and wow, you've got a powerful moment, that's going to sit with your reader and everybody who's hearing this right now on the podcast, right? We're all going to have that stuck in our heads. Yeah.
But those moments can affect us, and I think that's where no one ever writes the same story, So if everybody the same. Okay, here are the logistics of a death scene. Now I want you to write that. These are the facts, and the 5 people you give it to will come back with 5 completely different, unique takes on it because of that.
Right.
their own personal history cannot do anything other than influence how you portray it.
Mm-hmm.
I think. So I think what I took from that book is, don't be frightened to bring your own emotional highs and lows to this, and your own beliefs. I mean, I think as long as you, as you said, Alida, you don't tell them on the page. Well, it depends. I mean, some people want to write a prescriptive book, but
right.
it does depend. Some people will have a drive to emphasize perhaps a particular point of view. But outside of that, I do think that the power of your own experience coming through that shouldn't make you frightened. I think there's that sense of vulnerability of, well, if I write this, am I going to be laughed at because maybe I'm the only one who ever experienced death like that, or but in truth, that's not the case. And in truth, we read because we want that vicarious experience. Maybe we read because it gives us insights into our own mortality, or into something we might be dealing with at the time, or as an escape from something that we're dealing with at the time. So I think it's hard to write about death well without bringing yourself to it.
Yeah, I don't know how you could write a death without bringing yourself to it. And then, as writers writing, we have not died, or at least none of us have died and stayed dead, which means we're bringing our experience, but it's all sort of secondhand, third person, imagined experience. But the one thing we can draw on, at least many of us can, is carrying the grief forward. Danticat has an interesting question. She says, who do you want with you when you die? And any character you put with the dying character has to carry that death forward through the story. Right? And she says not just the absence of the dead, but the actual dying, which really has me thinking about the next death I'm going to see, next death scene I'm going to write, because it's a primary supporting character. So I've been thinking, all right, now my protagonist, it's not just the absence of this other character, but how is this going to keep playing out in the protagonist's life, to make that death worthy of the story, of the rest of the story.
Yes.
Yeah. Is that something you guys have thought about? The survivor, I should say. Kathryn, you're nodding.
Yeah, I'm currently bookending my draft with deaths. And I have a lot of revision ahead of me, so we're not even going to go there. But in the very beginning, my protagonist's mother dies, and to some extent, it's her quote fault, end quote, not really her fault, but she believes it to be. And in the end, she is there for another death, and how she handles that and the journey that she goes on in between is a very integral part of her character arc. And I think that carrying it with you is so important. You can't just have a death and then have it fall off the page. Especially, I mean, it doesn't matter to what extent that character is intertwined with that other character. Obviously, my protagonist's mother dying is going to have a huge impact on her.
Right.
She could have been walking home from the shops and seen a bus or a truck take out a bicyclist. That death is still going to be carried with her, right? It's going to affect things she sees. It's going to affect the next 6 times she sees a truck pulling out from the sidewalk. Like those are things that she will carry with her into the future. And I really like the way that Edwidge Danticat talked about that in this book too. Just that feeling of things carrying through, that you kind of learn to live with them in a different way, but your perspective has forever been shifted just slightly. And I really liked the way that she talked about that. The edges blur, they soften,
right?
But it's still there.
Yeah. And if we haven't, like Danticat been present through our mother's dying and death, and then gone through the grief process, if it isn't that personal for us as writers, how do we come to the story and create that experience for the character? You know, if we aren't writing from what we've lived, we have to draw on other experiences that, you know, are most likely not as intense or not as deep or prolonged as something like that. Do either of you have thoughts on what?
I think it helps to be widely read. I mean, you know, there's no other substitute for it. I mean, draw from other people's experience. We just mentioned that that we want readers to live vicariously, to experience that. Well, presumably we've drawn to story for the same reasons. Most writers love or loved reading at some point, and should still. I mean, I'm definitely side with Stephen King there. You know, if you don't have time to read, then you don't have time to write.
Right.
And so I do think that you can gain an awful lot from that. I mean, down from the very basic levels of understanding your genre, it's well worthwhile reading, you know, deeply in the genre just to understand how those things are treated, so that you know the types of expectations readers are probably likely to have as well. If you want your story to be commercially successful, I mean, you know, you may just be writing it totally from the heart and don't care,
right? And
that's fine. Which is fine too. So I think being widely read helps. Asking other people to maybe reflect on things as well. So, you know, we have our own friends and family who have witnessed things that we may not have. So, you know, you can always carry your little dictaphone or your phone and just ask people, you know, and there's nothing more powerful than the words that come out of somebody else's mouth when it comes to, you know, what happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think let yourself feel. And because I think a lot of times when we're reading for an experience or something may come up that we're not really ready to feel, and we just can skim past it. And I think if you're really wanting to write some of these deeper emotions and things, you have to let yourself feel. You have to really be vulnerable, and it's hard to do. You know, it's hard to allow yourself to do that. And I didn't even think about what you were saying, Robert, but like people like to talk about things that were very painful. Right? Not everybody, and not in the moment, and maybe it takes them a while, but like a lot of us process things that way. You know, we want to, so if you have somebody in your life that you were close with, that would be something that they would appreciate. Like, I open that conversation, because, and again, allow yourself to feel and be vulnerable with them in that moment. And you can learn so much from other people's experiences. Just, you know, don't be insensitive about it or anything. But people do. I mean, that's part of what we are as humans. We share experiences. We want to share experiences. We don't want to feel like we're the only one dealing with something.
Yeah, I think that's all really wonderful advice, to read a lot, to talk, and to feel and be vulnerable. And I think, you know, as a writer, it can be difficult to feel myself what I am crafting to be felt by another, because I'm busy with the mechanics of it. Yeah. So, you know, if you can rest your writing long enough and come back to it and try to sit down away from your computer, away from your workspace, and read it as a reader and see how it makes you feel. You know, take that feeling advice and apply it to your own work and see how it lands with you. And maybe it won't be quite as raw or real as if you were reading somebody else's piece and it was hitting you completely fresh. But, you know, that's another way to try to gauge that effectiveness there. And yeah. All right, so another Edwidge piece of wisdom here, Edwidge Danticat. Life changes in the ordinary instant. Thought that was a great note for all of us to take and maybe tack up on our computer screens here. The element of surprise. Yeah. Thoughts or how you execute it in your own writing?
The element of surprise when it comes to death, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've definitely done that. I think, I like reading books where the unexpected happens, yet when you reflect on it, it wasn't really that unexpected. So, it's, let me think of a good example. I was thinking about this before when we were talking. Again, I'll reference movies for this one. The movie Gravity, have you seen that one? With Sandra Bullock and George Clooney. It's extremely well done. It's you were going to suspend disbelief a fair bit, but it is extremely well done in terms of the special effects. But there's one moment where there's effectively it's not a meteor storm, but something goes badly wrong, and a whole bunch of debris and rocks start hurtling through orbit, and these astronauts are in orbit, and they happen to be on a spacewalk outside the vehicle they're in, doing some mechanical work, and they turn around to look at one of the others, and he's now just floating there, and where his face was is a big hole.
Oh wow!
Just because a meteorite just went boom straight through it. It's like, all of a sudden, it's just one instant from one to the next. The guy would never have known what hit him, literally, but the shock of seeing somebody you were momentarily talking to, and wondering why they've suddenly gone quiet, floating, frozen in space. Obviously, that's visually more easy to do in a movie like that, with that impact of the the instant of the impact. But I've read it in books where it's happened like that as well. And it's so you can definitely do the shocking stuff if that's what you were talking about. I think that showing that instant happening as a surprise, where it literally takes your breath away. Oh, geez,
Right, and that is what she's getting at, is the the ordinary moments. So the astronauts are just out there fixing something, doing a repair that's ordinary. It's expected. What could go wrong, and then somebody loses his head. Right?
It is foreshadowed, to be fair. So they've been given a warning, but all of a sudden it just comes. The warning is really too late. So but literally seconds before that, they're having an ordinary conversation, maybe about having kids or something like. I don't know. It was something. It was ordinary life in an extraordinary environment, and then an unpredictable event happens that then causes this and throws their life out of control. I mean, it's an inciting incident, really, but it's also cleverly tied into death.
Yeah, and I think these surprise moments often are the inciting incident. When I read that, I thought of Ian McEwan's novels, both Saturday and Enduring Love. At the open of the book, an ordinary day goes awry when something surprising or shocking happens, and then that sets us up for the rest of the novel. I don't know if either of you read a book or seen a movie where that happens in Act 2, or that.
I feel like death is too big to do that with. You know what I mean? Like, the only thing that I can think of that might happen in Act 2 would be more like tragic death. Like not necessarily something that's intimately connected with your character, or something that's just meant to shock you into the next thing.
Right.
It'd be more like a complicating factor that caused a.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that's part of it too. It could be a surprise, like somebody is stabbed or hit by a car or shot, or, a safe falls on their head on the sidewalk, whatever. So that could be the Act 2 tragic death. Something has to cause that death. So just because we're having that death happen later in the story doesn't mean we had to see it coming for chapters and chapters, as with the prolonged illness death, right?
Yeah, there's a trilogy that I read where the end of book 2 serves up probably, and again, I think this is really well done, surprising but inevitable. And actually, it's not a positive ending for book 2 either. It really does leave you up in the air, which is not my favourite, but there is closure, but it's negative closure, which is interesting. And it ends. I'm not going to mention it because it'll spoil it for others. It's a more recent trilogy. But literally, I think some of the final paragraphs are this really key character to leading a rebellion and a revolution, and it's about to succeed. Their head turns up in a box, and so all of a sudden, all of the plans that have been started from day 1 of book 1 at the end of book 2, and now can no longer be executed. That everything has to change from that. So it kind of leaves you think, how on earth are they going to recover from that? So in a way, that's Act 2 of a trilogy, the end of Act 2. So I suppose you could argue it might be the inciting incident for Act 3.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that it's make those deaths mean something. It's key. So whether it's this inciting incident of a story, or it's the climax of a poignant battle against a terminal diagnosis, I suppose it depends on what story you're telling. Right.
And when it's the inciting incident, then its significance is really focused on the plot. It launches our character's journey through the events of the plot. But when it comes later in the story, of course it has a place in the plot, and that has to be significant. But I think then we're more concerned with the character arc, with the emotional impact it has on our reader. And, it may create a turning point that changes the rest of our plot, but that resonance is about the emotion. It's about the character arc.
Yeah, and presumably that's down to what we've done to attach the reader. So if if the death occurs early on, then you haven't had much time. You've got to be really clever to be able to attach the reader to that character and make them care. Right. Whereas if you're all the way into the end of a 3-book, the end of a second book in a 3-book trilogy, or right at the end of a long book, it's a different thing. And then you actually got to take even more care, I suppose, as a writer, to make sure that death isn't just lost. That you're writing. Oh yeah, I'm going to write about this great death scene, and you miss all the important points that Edwidge illustrates and brings to the page. And if you miss all of that, it can leave the reader feeling quite empty. That okay, well that didn't really do much for me, because we didn't feel the loss, or we didn't experience that character's journey through the book, so their death therefore becomes trivial.
Yeah. What any notes you two want to bring up? Any points from the text? Let me turn it over to you guys.
I read it a long time ago.
I know, it's been a while since we scheduled this.
And I didn't take any notes. I didn't do what Kathryn. She's very good. She read it and I read it once and thought, oh yeah, that was interesting. It was kind of a memoir.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I cannot read a nonfiction book only once. I will get nothing out of it. If I read it twice, then I actually start to understand what they're trying to say. I think the only thing that I took notes on that we haven't really touched on is the tragedy section, where she talks about, specifically she was talking about the earthquake in Haiti, but it could really be any tragic event. And there were 2 points that I thought she brought up that were really important to me, like for if you were going to attempt to write something that was on that scale. And the first one was that this is a quote, the rescues provided a dramatic arc for viewers that wasn't death. So people watching what was happening on television didn't actually get to see the death that was occurring.
Right.
And so it actually got buried. So if you wanted to, like her point was, if you wanted to explore the actual death part of it, you need to get beyond what the media would show and into that really intimate moments. Like she talks about family members sitting outside of piles of rubble, where talking to their other family members who are never going to make it out. And just that where there is no resolution. And I think if you're writing tragedy, you want that feeling of, you want it so badly to resolve well. Oh, why can't we just dig them out of the rubble? Why can't we just get to them? And then not being able to do that. That's where the tragic moment comes in for the reader. And then she had a really interesting quote also about this. There says, "We are often told not to compare tragedies, that past horrors give us a basis upon which to create a new language." So going back into listening to, looking at past things that have happened that are tragic, that are horrific, can give you a language with which to describe what has come next, which I thought was a really interesting way of approaching writing something, is to go back and look at, you know, other things that have happened in order to give yourself language to convey it. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Wow. That has me thinking about your point of view character again. You know, like if your tragedy is, say, the earthquake in Haiti, then but your protagonist might be someone here in America, as, you know, as Edwidge Danticat's situation, then how do you build that tragedy through your story? And it's through that sort of rescuing process, just as the media does. You know, as the earthquake is happening, there's only so much sort of footage on the ground in the moment, right? But we can feel like we're there now with the rescuers, because that's what's current, you know. So you can do a lot with the moment of the event if you have that character in that space, but you can also continue the caring and the emotional impact of the piece through that sort of prolonging effect.
Right. Yeah, I guess I never really thought about that in terms of what the media was doing, was creating a reason for people to care. Right. Because if you are like me, like it was different for Danticcat because she had relatives there. So she immediately cared. Right. And so you get that sense of, you know, as a protagonist, she was like, boom, like I have a reason to care about these people. But for like me, I don't have family there. I've never been there. I've never visited. What that provides for me then is narrative where I start to care about the people. And then as you start hearing about the people that couldn't be rescued, it touches you differently than if you just knew nothing about any of it, you know? So then it just becomes numbers. Like, oh, great, so many people died. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't hit you emotionally. Whereas if you do experience those rescue stories, those moments where you get to visually walk through and see with the rescuers and get that moment of resolution, and then you want it for everybody, and it doesn't happen.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think when I was talking before about the personification, that what you've just reminded me of is that thing about proximity, where, you know, if there's a child stuck in the drain and it's in your neighborhood and the fire and rescue and everybody are there trying to rescue that child stuck in the drain and they're worried because the rains are coming, it features prominently on the news. But there could be 1,000 people dying a day of starvation in Bangladesh and it's not even reported because it's distant from us. So I suppose in novels you've got to think about, do you want it to be distant or do you want it to be proximal? And if you need it to affect the character, but it's a distant event, you've got to find a way to make that proximal. And so whether it's via friendship with someone who does know people there, or whether it's because there's some event, maybe they're a tutor and they're Skyping somebody at the moment in that particular vicinity, and that's where it happens in front of them. Or so that personification also has to make it proximal. So that so the meaning is conveyed, because death's become meaningless to us when, I mean, a 250,000 people died in the tsunami in 2004. That's that's a lot of people. You know, if a 250,000 people died where I am right now, it would be the entire region gone.
Yeah.
And yet it's very hard to put that into perspective. And I think when we're writing deaths, perspective is all we have, really.
Right.
Yeah, we have to bring that experience into the reader's grasp and make it tangible in some way in order to make it meaningful. You know, as you're saying, Robert, when it's just statistics, what does it mean to us, right?
Yeah.
So with the media, they're using the imagery and the storytelling and, you know, all the sounds, the audio that goes with that video footage, and they get as close up and personal as they can to the most dramatic moment they can find on any given newscast, because that's what makes it impact the audience, right? So that proximal piece is critical to creating that emotional impact with the reader.
I think what Kathryn said is well said, though, because the one thing they won't show, and rightly so, is moments of death. So, you know, that is withheld from us. And so we see all these, and maybe, as you see, they reframe it into hope if it's a rescue,
Right.
if it becomes a rescue mission or a search and rescue. It's because, you know, no one wants to see, you know, 250,000 bodies washed up on a beach. Or at least I think time also gives issue, you know, because, for example, I don't think any media would be particularly worried about showing mass graves of Jews or other minorities who have been, you know, suffered genocide, because that's somehow, it's not personalized, because there's no, you know, you're not seeing your person in there, and it's shocking enough to say we should never see this again.
Right.
So that's interesting as well. That again, I suppose that's perspective. But something else that occurred to me when you were talking there as well is, you might have a character in your book who is capable of sending people to their deaths, and because they're not connected, and yet another character, you can create conflict there because another character does care, or has experienced a personal loss because of what this other character has done. So we can, it's, you know, don't be frightened of flipping the sides around there. You know, do you have a character in there who doesn't care because either A, it's just a statistic, or B, they're somehow, you know, psychopathic and they don't have that feel. You know, there's all the different ways to spin that.
Yeah, that would be interesting to write the character who doesn't care, who lacks empathy. And I do know there are books, especially fantasy novels, in which the you know, there's a torturer or somebody who who doesn't care, who has been desensitized to those acts of violence.
I honestly, as a fantasy reader, and I love fantasy, so don't, you know, take this the wrong way, I think fantasy skims past death too quickly and too easily often. And I think we've become okay with our characters being okay with death in fantasy, and we forget, because it becomes kind of romanticized, this idea of, like, you know, swords and sorcery and close combat, that, like, probably every one of those men who used to kill people close at hand were suffering dramatically from post-traumatic stress and all of those things, because they had to literally kill someone, you know, 6 feet from them, or, you know, 2 feet from them, you know, maybe more than once. So I think sometimes we use it to flip, because it's genre conventions, and we're just like, oh, death. So again, it's that, what does it mean to your character? You know, allow it to be something really powerful and really affect them. Otherwise, you do end up with a ton of sociopathic fantasy protagonists. And I would argue that they lean that direction. A lot of them don't have the empathy and the care that necessarily, you know, an actual human would, because of what they're dealing with. So
that's right. They become vigilantes in a way. And even in the same, you know, I'm thinking of Lord of the Rings, for example. You know, you've got that incredible moment when that everybody would have experienced when they first read it, when at the end of book 1, Gandalf dies or sacrifices himself, flee you fools, and it's well done in the movie as well, I think, because it shows the characters wandering around aimless. There's no ambient noise. It's all just music and just showing them, walking and looking at each other, not able to speak. And yet you've got another scene where Legolas, I think, and Gimli maybe are counting
41,
how many,
42.
Yeah, exactly. Because
he's twitching because my axe is in his nervous system.
That's right. Yeah. So there's that sort of it goes from one to the other. Or when Sean Bean's character, I can't remember his name, takes all Boromir, who thank you, who's betrayed them and then comes back and takes all the arrows, and that made me cry, that moment, so it's interesting that even in the same series, death can be both flip and unbelievably personal. And so I suppose it's that you're not really attached to orcs. I mean, they're horrible, they're smelly, dirty,
right.
Not bad. I mean,
right, yeah, they're supposed
but you're
to
right,
be,
yeah, but there's so much, but there's so much massacre in that story.
Yeah.
Unbelievable amounts. And it doesn't necessarily impact the main characters except when it's one of their own, like Boromir or Gandalf. So it's very well said, actually, about the genre there. And maybe that's one of the things that, George R.R. Martin has stumbled on, is that the idea that, death is going to happen, and it may happen even to the character you most love.
So I think the last section that Danticat brings us to is the idea of the afterlife and the way culture affects our experience of death. She talks about prayers and last words. Do you give your dying character last words? Or what about the survivor character? Are there dreams of the dead? Is there guilt? Are there wishes? Thoughts on the afterlife or aftermath, I guess, for our surviving character?
I think it provides motivation or demotivation, depending on the point of view, the worldview. I was going to say earlier on that worldview, I think, is very important as well when writing death. There's a series I read where there's a particular subset of society that have been kind of conned into believing that I suppose a bit like Middle Eastern religions, where you can be a martyr and it means that you're promised by God something which is far greater than the life on earth, and that provides motivation, and it provides structure within that particular society. It influences behavior. And then you've got other societies where there's zero belief in the afterlife. So I think to a degree that's going to influence how you portray the death and the reaction for both the dying, the character dying, and the person who's on the receiving end of it, or so-called mourning. So are you mourning, or are you celebrating, or are you? So to some degree, I guess religion and worldview is going to come in there, and even humor. Right. I remember in this episode of Red Dwarf where they're battling an android who's come to terminate them. So it's kind of a funny version of Terminator, and all the robots have been led to believe that there's what do they call it? Android heaven or something like that. I can't remember what they call it. I have a name for it. And the story amongst all the robots is that, because otherwise where would all the calculators go? Because I've got a drawer full of dead calculators here, It's like, why do you keep those? So there must be somewhere for them to go once they die. And the way they defeat the android in the end is confuse its logic circuits, because one of the other robots has become partly humanized. Crichton has become, they've taught him to lie, and he's understood that there is no android heaven, finally. And so they say, but it's all been a lie by humans to make us subservient. And then this android stops and starts going to this sort of terrible logic loop, and then says, but where do all the calculators go? And that's it. It's like, but that instant of challenge of a model of the world of the afterlife suddenly throws a character into a spin. So yes, I do think that our worldview beliefs or our religious beliefs make a massive difference to how you might describe a death or use it in a plot.
Yeah, they do. And I think it's easy to lose sight of that if religion or religious culture is not a part of your world, if you haven't been sort of bringing that into your character's life as part of the story, and then you have someone die. And, with my character, Evelyn, her mother has passed away. And, I hadn't really thought yet about where does Evelyn think her mother is? Is she just food for worms? Is there a heaven? Is there, an afterlife where they'll meet up? What? And I do know Evelyn's parents did not raise her in any sort of religion, but when she goes to the state school, they are certainly going to have some sort of service because the belief then was that, religion makes moral people. So that's something I still have to figure out is how is this little bit of religious training she's been receiving going to shape her belief? And, what does she want it to be? Is it more painful to think the religion is lying to her and that, or does that give her a motive to sort of buy into some of the religious education in order to think of her mother in a better place and to imagine a reunion? Kathryn's nodding, and I'm expecting words.
I definitely. I feel like every culture has always had something to do with the spiritual and after death. Like there's always, because we just don't like thinking about our life having bookends and not, that box is not a happy place, right? Especially not when you've been given a terminal diagnosis or someone that you love is gone, right? And so I think not only can you really use that powerfully within your character's culture and their background and their backstory and their motivation and all of that, but I love at the end of this, again, the book, where she writes the prayer that her mother, that she wants to hear from her mother, right? This kind of like dedication. And I read it through, and I love that she talked about how it's like all the things that she would want, but she tried also to reflect her mother honestly and her mother's humor. So that it's almost like she can hear her mother saying it. And so it's like, no matter what your character believes about the end of life and the afterlife, they're going to use their, their dead relative, their dead friend, their dead whatever, to probably influence how they're acting. And even if they have to make it up, this is what they would have said to me, or I could almost hear her saying, or, like that brings comfort, it brings peace, and it brings motivation in different ways. So yeah, I think it's another tool in your tool belt of when you use death to bring your character even more purpose, even more meaning.
Right. And I like how you said, this is what the dead person would say to me. It's a reminder not to let that dead character drop off the page. But just as your survivor needs to process the event and go through grief or whatever kind of adaptation has to happen, it's going to happen because of remembering that character, of feeling that influence, that connection we feel with someone important to us doesn't end when that person dies. It just changes.
Yeah, it's true. The physical being is gone, but there's something that lives on in the mind.
Yeah, well, let's wrap this up. Do either of you have final thoughts about writing death or the book, The Art of Death?
Well, I'd recommend it as long as, you know, with the caveat that it's not going to necessarily teach you the mechanics of writing death scenes.
Right.
But it is definitely finely observed, and there's some wonderful examples in there. And I love that Kathryn has grouped that too, so that's worth looking for when you read it.
Yeah, I think, I would agree. I would recommend it more as a opportunity to read some really great stuff about death. You know, and if you're into like really examining things and thinking things through and having time to really sit with something, this is a great book.
Yes.
To read.
Yeah, it definitely requires reflection. It's not a passive read.
No.
No. All right. Well, thank you so much for listening this week, and please subscribe, rate, and review. Thank you for listening to the StoryWorks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.